I am stronger than I look!
Mr. Cole?
She came to the Bitterroot Mountains to escape a monster, carrying a dark secret beneath layers of heavy wool and petticoats. But when the solitary mountain man she married cut away her frozen dress, revealing the brutal, blooming bruises on her skin, his quiet life shattered. His only question: who hurt you? The train ride from Boston to Missoula, Montana, in the autumn of 1883, was a grueling, bone-rattling journey of smoke and steel. But to Abigail Weston, it was the rhythm of salvation. Every chug of the locomotive put another mile between her and the gilded cage she had fled. She sat stiffly in the third-class carriage, her hands tightly clutching a worn leather satchel that contained her entire life, 3 modest dresses, a handful of silver dollars, and a stolen leather-bound ledger that could hang a very powerful man in Massachusetts. Abigail was a mail-order bride. It was an act of sheer desperation. When she saw the advertisement in the Boston Daily Advertiser placed by a man seeking a wife willing to endure the absolute isolation of the high Bitterroot Mountains, she hadn't hesitated. Isolation was exactly what she needed. She needed a place where the long, violent arm of Nathaniel Reed could never reach her. Nathaniel, a wealthy railroad magnate and her former fiancé, was a man who charmed high society by day and terrorized Abigail behind closed doors by night. The police were in his pocket. Her family was in his debt. The marriage agency was her only way out. When Abigail finally stepped off the train into the muddy, bustling streets of Missoula, the cold mountain air hit her like a physical blow. She stood on the wooden boardwalk, shivering in a thin, traveling coat, looking for a man she only knew from a terse, 3-line letter. "Miss Weston?" The voice was a deep, resonant rumble. Abigail spun around, instinctively taking a step back and raising a hand to her chest, a defensive flinch she couldn't suppress. Standing before her was Gideon Cole. He was a mountain of a man, clad in buckskin and thick wool, smelling of wood smoke, pine needles, and raw earth. A thick, dark beard obscured the lower half of his face, but his eyes, a striking, pale storm gray, were sharp and assessing. He carried a Winchester rifle slung casually over his broad shoulder, and a hunting knife was strapped to his thigh. To a refined city woman, he should have been terrifying. But as Gideon looked down at her pale, frightened face, his eyes softened with a quiet, grounding calm. "I'm Gideon Cole," he said softly, making no sudden movements. "You're smaller than I figured from your letters." "I am stronger than I look, Mr. Cole," Abigail replied, her voice trembling slightly, though she tipped her chin up in defiance. Gideon offered a slow, solitary nod. "We'll see. The mountain tests everyone. We need to see Reverend Josiah Miller before the sun drops. The trail up the ridge takes 2 days, and the snows are coming early this year." Their wedding was a stark, 15-minute affair in the dusty parlor of the local church. There were no flowers, no music, and no smiles. Just a legal binding of 2 strangers, one seeking survival, the other seeking an extra pair of hands, and some company for the brutal winter ahead. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, Gideon did not move to kiss her. He simply turned, picked up her heavy trunk as if it weighed no more than a bundle of twigs, and said, "Let's go home, Mrs. Cole." The journey up into the Bitterroots was a grueling ascent into a wild, untamed world. They rode on horseback, climbing steep, narrow trails flanked by towering ponderosa pines and jagged granite cliffs. Abigail clung to the saddle horn, her muscles screaming in protest, but she did not complain. She watched Gideon ride ahead of her. He navigated the treacherous terrain with an effortless, predatory grace. For the first few days in his remote, sturdy log cabin, they moved around each other like ghosts. Gideon was a man of few words. He left before dawn to check his trap lines and returned at dusk with fresh meat and firewood. Abigail threw herself into domestic labor, desperately trying to prove her worth. She scrubbed the rough-hewn floors, baked bread, and mended his heavy wool socks. Yet, the trauma of Boston haunted her. If Gideon accidentally dropped a piece of firewood with a loud crack, Abigail would violently flinch, her breath hitching in her throat. If he walked up behind her while she was cooking, she would press her back against the counter, her eyes wide with animal panic. Gideon noticed. He noticed how she always positioned herself near an exit. He noticed how she slept on the very edge of the small bed they shared, curled into a tight defensive ball, fully clothed in her thickest nightgown. He never touched her. He never demanded his husbandly rights. He simply gave her space, watching her with those quiet, storm-gray eyes, piecing together a puzzle he didn't yet understand. "You don't need to be afraid of the shadows here, Abigail," Gideon said one evening, sharpening his hunting knife by the hearth. "Only the wolves. And they don't come past the tree line." "I'm not afraid of wolves, Gideon," Abigail whispered, staring into the roaring fire. "I'm afraid of men in tailored suits." By late November, the first major blizzard hit the Bitterroots, sealing the cabin off from the rest of the world under 4 feet of snow. The isolation was absolute. For Abigail, it was a profound relief. The mountain was an impenetrable fortress, but nature in Montana was as unforgiving as it was beautiful. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. The sky was a bruised, heavy purple, threatening more snow. Gideon was out in the shed repairing snowshoes, and Abigail had gone to the nearby creek to fetch fresh water. The creek was partially frozen, the rocks along the bank slick with black ice. As Abigail leaned over to dip the heavy iron bucket into the rushing water, her leather boots slipped. With a sharp cry, she went tumbling down the embankment, crashing hard onto the rocks before plunging waist-deep into the freezing, turbulent water. The shock of the cold was instantaneous and paralyzing. It felt like 1,000 needles driving into her flesh. She scrambled frantically, her heavy wool dress and thick petticoats instantly soaking up the icy water, dragging her down like lead weights. "Gideon!" she screamed, her voice barely carrying over the roar of the creek. She managed to claw her way up the icy bank, collapsing onto the snow, shivering so violently her teeth rattled. Her ankle throbbed with a sickening, hot pain, twisted badly in the fall. She tried to stand, but her leg gave out. Within seconds, the cabin door flew open. Gideon came tearing through the snowdrift, his massive strides eating up the distance between them. He didn't say a word. He reached her, scooped her up into his arms as easily as if she were a child, and sprinted back toward the cabin. He kicked the door shut behind them and set her down on the rug in front of the blazing hearth. Abigail's lips were already turning a dangerous shade of blue. "You're going to freeze to death in those clothes," Gideon ordered, his voice sharp with urgency. "Take them off, now." Abigail's eyes widened in sheer terror. The panic of the freezing water was suddenly eclipsed by a much darker, deeper terror. "No," she stuttered, clutching the soaked collar of her dress with numb, trembling fingers. "No, I can do it. Turn around. Please, turn around." Gideon frowned, turning his back to the fire to give her privacy. "Hurry, Abigail. Hypothermia doesn't wait for modesty." She tried. Her frozen fingers fumbled uselessly with the dozen tiny buttons running down the back of her bodice. Her shivering was so violent she couldn't grip the fabric. After a minute of agonizing struggle, a soft sob broke from her throat. Her body was giving up. The lethargy of the cold was creeping into her brain. Gideon heard the sob. He turned around to see her slumped on the rug, her eyes half closed, shaking uncontrollably in the puddle of freezing water. "Enough," he growled softly. He knelt beside her, pulling his sharp hunting knife from its sheath. Abigail shrieked, scrambling backward like a cornered animal, her eyes locked on the blade. "Don't! Please, Nathaniel, don't!" she screamed, her mind fracturing, projecting the face of her abuser onto the mountain man trying to save her. Gideon froze. "Nathaniel, Abigail, look at me," Gideon commanded, his voice dropping to a low, soothing baritone, the same tone he used to calm a spooked horse. "It's Gideon. I am not going to hurt you. But I have to cut this dress off you, or your heart is going to stop. Do you understand? I am going to cut the laces." Tears streamed down her freezing cheeks as she gave a tiny, defeated nod. With precise, gentle movements, Gideon slid the blade beneath the wet fabric of her bodice and sliced upward, destroying the dress. He peeled the heavy soaked wool off her shoulders, then cut through the layers of wet petticoats, pulling them away to expose her bare skin to the warmth of the fire. He reached for a thick, dry wool blanket to wrap her in, but as his eyes fell upon her shivering body, he stopped dead. The heavy iron pot simmering over the fire seemed to go silent. The wind, howling outside, faded away. Abigail's pale skin was a canvas of horrific violence. Spanning across her ribs, down her hips, and wrapping around her thighs were bruises. Some were old, fading into sickening shades of yellow and sickly green. Others were newer, deep, angry, mottled purple and black. There were burn marks on her left shoulder, small and circular, like the end of a cigar. Across her ribcage was a long, jagged scar that had healed poorly. Gideon dropped the knife. The clatter of the steel against the wooden floorboards echoed like a gunshot in the silent cabin. He stared at the roadmap of torture painted on his wife's body. The muscle in his jaw feathered. His massive hands, which could snap a wolf's neck, began to tremble with a silent, terrifying rage. The quiet, stoic mountain man vanished, replaced by something ancient and incredibly dangerous. He grabbed the thick wool blanket and wrapped it tightly around her trembling shoulders, pulling it snug to hide the scars, preserving whatever dignity she had left. He lifted her gently, placing her on the bed, and piled 3 more furs on top of her. He pulled a wooden chair right to the edge of the bed and sat down. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his storm-gray eyes burning into hers. "Who hurt you?" Gideon asked. His voice wasn't loud. It was deadly quiet. It was the sound of a hammer pulling back on a loaded revolver. Abigail sobbed, the warmth of the furs finally thawing her frozen limbs, but shattering the ice around her heart. She couldn't hold it in anymore. The dam broke. "His name is Nathaniel Reed," she wept, clutching the furs to her chin. "He is a powerful man in Boston. We were to be married. When I tried to leave him, he locked me in his cellar. He told me if I ever ran, he would find me and kill me. And I know he will, because—" She choked on her tears, squeezing her eyes shut. "Because what, Abigail?" Gideon coaxed gently, reaching out to brush a wet strand of hair from her forehead, his first voluntary touch since they met. "Because I stole from him," she whispered in terror. "I took his private ledger. It proves he bribed federal judges and hired men to murder union workers on the rail lines. I took it to guarantee he wouldn't come after me, but I was wrong. He has men everywhere. If he finds out I'm here, he'll kill us both, Gideon." Gideon Cole didn't look away. He didn't panic. A terrifyingly calm smile touched the corner of his bearded lips. "Let him send his men," Gideon said, his voice as cold as the glacial ice outside. "Let them climb my mountain. They'll find out real quick that out here, a man's money buys nothing but a shallow grave." But even as Gideon made his vow, 100 miles below them in the bustling saloon of Missoula, a man in a sharp black suit and a bowler hat was sliding a silver dollar across the mahogany bar. His name was Elias Cobb, the most ruthless bounty hunter on the East Coast, and he was holding a photograph of a beautiful, frightened woman. "I'm looking for a runaway," Cobb smiled, his eyes dead and flat. "Name of Abigail Weston, and I'm willing to pay a fortune to the man who points me to the trail." The bitter winter of 1883 transformed the Bitterroot Mountains into an ocean of impassable white, trapping Abigail and Gideon in a world built for 2. Yet, inside the sturdy log cabin, the frost began to thaw. As the weeks bled into months, Abigail's ankle healed, but more importantly, her spirit began to mend. The terrifying, flinching city girl slowly dissolved, replaced by a woman hardened by the mountain and forged by the quiet, unwavering respect of her husband. Gideon never pushed her. He never demanded explanations beyond what she freely gave. Instead, he handed her a Colt single-action army revolver. "A predator only strikes when he thinks you are prey," Gideon told her one brittle, sunlit January morning. They stood behind the cabin, breath pluming in the freezing air like locomotive smoke. He stood behind her, adjusting her grip on the heavy iron. "Out here, Abigail, you are no one's prey. You are the mountain." Under his patient tutelage, she learned the lethal arithmetic of survival. She learned to load the Colt, to compensate for the kick, and to hit a pine cone from 30 yards. She learned how to skin a rabbit, how to read the tracks of a cougar in the fresh powder, and how to stay perfectly, invisibly still. And in the quiet hours of the night, illuminated by the amber glow of the hearth, a deep and profound romance blossomed. It wasn't the fiery, toxic passion of her Boston society days. It was something far stronger. It was rooted in trust, in shared silence, and in the safety of Gideon's massive, calloused hands. When he finally kissed her, a gentle, questioning brush of his lips against hers on the first night of February, she did not flinch. She leaned into him, anchoring her fingers in his thick beard, finally feeling the warmth she had been denied her entire life. But 100 miles away, the ice was melting. Elias Cobb was not a man deterred by weather. In Missoula, he had spent the winter buying drinks, greasing palms, and listening to the drunken ramblings of fur trappers. By early March, as the spring thaw turned the lower trails into a treacherous sludge of mud and ice, Cobb finally found his guide, a desperate, whiskey-soaked prospector named Hiram Potts. "I know the ridge Cole lives on," Hiram slurred, pointing a trembling finger at a hand-drawn map in the back room of the saloon. "But you don't want to cross Gideon Cole. He ain't a normal man. He's a ghost in them woods. He'll smell you coming a mile away." "I am not paying you to be a coward, Hiram," Cobb replied smoothly, sliding a stack of greenbacks across the table. "I am paying you to point the way. Bring 2 of the worst men you know. We leave at dawn." Hiram recruited 2 ruthless cattle rustlers, Clayton and Wyatt, men who cared nothing for the legend of Gideon Cole and everything for the bounty Cobb promised. The 4 men began the brutal ascent. It took them 4 agonizing days to navigate the swollen rivers and the dangerous collapsing snow bridges. When they finally reached the tree line below Gideon's Ridge, Cobb drew his revolver and calmly shot Hiram in the back of the head. The prospector's body tumbled down the ravine into the rushing meltwater. "We don't need a guide anymore," Cobb said, stepping over the bloody snow, his dead eyes fixed on the smoke rising from the chimney in the distance. "And we don't need to split the money 4 ways. Let's go collect the runaway." Back at the cabin, the wind shifted. Gideon, chopping wood by the shed, suddenly stopped. His axe hung suspended in the air. He didn't hear a sound, but the crows in the distant ponderosas had suddenly scattered, taking flight in a massive, chaotic flock. A heavy, metallic clatter echoed faintly down the ridge. It was the sound of a tin can rattling against a rock. Gideon had strung tripwires across the only 3 viable approaches to the cabin months ago. He dropped the axe. He moved with a terrifying, silent speed, bursting through the cabin door. Abigail was at the stove, humming softly as she stirred a pot of venison stew. She turned, a smile on her face, but it vanished the moment she saw his storm-gray eyes. "They're here," Gideon said. His voice was devoid of panic, replaced by an icy, tactical calm. He grabbed his Winchester rifle from the mantel and shoved a box of cartridges into his coat pocket. "Get into the root cellar. Take the ledger. Take the shotgun. Do not open the trapdoor for anyone but me. Do you understand, Abigail?" Her heart hammered against her ribs, the ghost of Nathaniel Reed clawing at her throat. But she looked at the Colt resting on the table, then up at her husband. She was no longer the frightened girl crying in the freezing water. "I understand," she said, her voice steady. She grabbed the ledger from its hiding place beneath the floorboards, took the heavy shotgun, and climbed down into the dark, earthen cellar, pulling the heavy rug over the trap door. Gideon didn't wait in the cabin. He slipped out the back door, blending into the shadows of the dense, ancient pines, becoming the ghost Hiram had warned them about. The hunt had begun. Clayton and Wyatt moved clumsily through the heavy, wet snow, their rifles raised, their eyes scanning the silent cabin. Elias Cobb hung back, letting the 2 rustlers draw the first fire. Cobb was a predator, but he knew better than to walk blindly into a mountain man's den. "Looks quiet," Wyatt grunted, spitting tobacco juice onto the pristine white snow. "Maybe they ain't home." That was the last thing Wyatt ever said. A sharp, deafening crack shattered the mountain's silence. Wyatt's chest exploded in a mist of crimson as the .44-40 bullet from Gideon's Winchester struck him dead center. He crumpled instantly. Clayton panicked, firing wildly into the tree line, splintering bark and snapping branches. "Where is he?" "I don't see." Another crack. Clayton's rifle spun out of his hands as a bullet shattered his shoulder. He screamed, dropping to his knees. Before he could draw his sidearm, Gideon materialized from the brush like a vengeful spirit, moving faster than a man his size had any right to. He didn't waste another bullet. Gideon swung the heavy wooden stock of his rifle, connecting with Clayton's temple with a sickening crunch. The rustler collapsed, unconscious and bleeding out into the snow. But Gideon's instincts screamed. He spun around. Cobb was gone. While Gideon was dispatching the hired guns, the bounty hunter had used the distraction to flank the perimeter. He had slipped through the open back door of the cabin. Inside, Cobb moved silently across the wooden floorboards. He saw the unfinished stew on the stove. He saw the rug slightly bunched up near the center of the room. A cruel, triumphant smile spread across his face. He kicked the rug aside, revealing the iron ring of the trapdoor. Down in the dark, Abigail heard the heavy footsteps. They weren't Gideon's measured, heavy strides. They were sharp, predatory. She raised the double-barreled shotgun, her hands slick with sweat, aiming it directly at the wooden planks above her head. Suddenly, the trapdoor was violently yanked open. Blinding daylight poured into the cellar. Abigail didn't hesitate. She pulled the trigger. The deafening boom of the shotgun echoed through the cabin. A spray of buckshot tore through the opening. Cobb let out a sharp cry of pain as several pellets shredded his left arm, but the cunning bounty hunter had anticipated it, throwing his body backward just in time to avoid the lethal brunt of the blast. Before Abigail could cock the second barrel, Cobb blindly thrust his revolver into the opening and fired twice. The bullet slammed into the dirt walls, showering her in dust and debris. "Drop it, you little bitch," Cobb roared, his arm bleeding heavily. "Or the next one takes your head off." Abigail's vision blurred with dust. She heard Cobb leap down the ladder. A heavy boot kicked the shotgun from her grip, nearly breaking her wrist. Cobb grabbed her by the hair, hauling her violently out of the cellar and tossing her onto the cabin floor. Abigail scrambled backward, her back hitting the heavy oak table. Cobb stood over her, his left arm dripping blood onto the floorboards, his revolver aimed right between her eyes. "Nathaniel Reed sends his regards," Cobb sneered, cocking the hammer of the gun. "And he wants his book back. Get away from my wife." Cobb froze. Standing in the open doorway blocking the sunlight was Gideon Cole. His Winchester was raised, aimed dead at Cobb's chest. The air in the cabin grew instantly suffocating. "Drop the rifle, mountain man," Cobb spat, pressing the barrel of his revolver harder against Abigail's forehead. "Or I paint this floor with her brains. You might shoot me, but she dies first. Drop it." Gideon's eyes flicked to Abigail. He saw the terror in her eyes, but he also saw something else. He saw her right hand slowly, silently inching toward the top of her leather boot. Gideon lowered the rifle an inch. "You won't make it off this mountain, Cobb." "I'll take my chances," Cobb laughed, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Now." Abigail didn't scream. She didn't close her eyes. She moved with the explosive speed Gideon had drilled into her. She pulled the razor-sharp hunting knife from her boot and drove it upward with all her strength, burying the 6-inch steel blade deep into the back of Cobb's right knee. Cobb shrieked, his leg buckling instantly. His gun jerked wildly into the air as it fired, the bullet tearing through the cabin roof. In that split second, Gideon raised his Winchester and fired. The bullet struck Cobb square in the chest. The bounty hunter was thrown backward, crashing through the wooden chairs, dead before he hit the ground. Silence crashed back into the cabin, heavy and ringing with the smell of cordite and copper. Abigail sat on the floor, breathing heavily, staring at Cobb's lifeless body. Gideon dropped his rifle and fell to his knees beside her, pulling her into his massive arms, crushing her against his chest. She buried her face in his neck, not crying out of fear, but out of sheer, overwhelming adrenaline. They had won. The monsters were dead. But the real war wasn't over. As Gideon searched Cobb's coat, he found a folded telegraph from Boston. It confirmed Nathaniel Reed was preparing to send 20 more men if Cobb failed. Hiding was no longer an option. The mountain couldn't hold off an army forever. That evening, by the light of the fire, Abigail opened the stolen ledger. "We can't just run," Abigail said, tracing the ink that held her abuser's darkest secrets. "We have to strike back. We have to cut the head off the snake." Gideon nodded slowly. "How?" "We send this to the one man Nathaniel Reed can't buy," she said, her eyes flashing with a dangerous resolve. "William A. Pinkerton, the head of the National Detective Agency in Chicago. My father used to say Pinkerton agents answered to no one but God and the federal government. If William Pinkerton gets this ledger, Nathaniel's empire will burn." 2 days later, Gideon rode down the treacherous mountain pass alone. He carried a heavy wax-sealed package containing the ledger, Cobb's telegraph, and a sworn affidavit penned by Abigail detailing every bribe, murder, and extortion Nathaniel Reed had orchestrated. Gideon handed it directly to a trusted U.S. mail courier on a fortified train bound for Illinois. 3 weeks later, the Thunder arrived in Boston, armed with the irrefutable proof from the ledger. William A. Pinkerton personally led a raid on Nathaniel Reed's lavish estate, flanked by a dozen federal marshals. Reed, stripped of his bought and paid-for police protection, was dragged from his mansion in irons, screaming threats that fell on deaf ears. The ledger unraveled a massive syndicate of corruption, landing Reed and his accomplices in a federal penitentiary for the rest of their natural lives. High up in the Bitterroot Mountains, the spring flowers began to bloom, painting the rugged landscape in vibrant purples and yellows. Abigail Weston was dead, buried in the ashes of her old life. In her place stood Abigail Cole, the wife of the mountain man, a woman who had faced the shadows and emerged victorious. As she stood on the porch, watching Gideon ride back up the trail toward their home, she smiled, knowing the bruises were finally gone, and the only thing left was the dawn. Wow, what a story of survival and finding true strength. Abigail proved that you can't just outrun your demons, sometimes you have to turn around and fight them. If you love this intense, twist-filled Wild West romance, please hit that like button, share this video with your fellow story lovers, and subscribe to our